Please join me this morning in welcoming Raphael Lazano Hemmer to IdeaFestival.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alice. It's a delight to be in Louisville for the first time. I'm going to give you a presentation that is actually really, really fast. I'm just been diagnosed as hypothyroid disorder, and so I'm taking this thing called Synthroid, which makes me very fast. So if I'm too fast or I'm sweating too much or something like that, just flag me and say, you got to bring it down a notch. When I told my assistants at the studio that I was going to double my metabolism, they're all like, no, don't, Raphael, don't take that. That's a bad drug. But anyway, so I'm like this, and it's 9 a.m., and thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to be here at this festival. I have 2 lines of work, a little bit like Alice described. I do large-scale interactive installations in public space. Usually, these pieces tour, and they get presented in different contexts. Usually, they're very large. I often say that my work is as big as my insecurities, but now I go to psychotherapy, and I'm also doing little things. So I'll be showing you both the huge, large-scale stuff and then some smaller pieces. So for the past 20 years, I've been experimenting between media. I have a degree in science. I have a chemistry degree, and then my friends at school were either actors or writers or musicians, and so I hung out with the wrong crowd and I ended up in the arts. And a lot of what I do, you will see, is inspired by science. Sometimes it actually derives from phenomena that I did study during chemistry or science in general. But other times the works are much more about the traditional sort of aspects that arts looks at. A lot of people think that we're living some kind of new renaissance where, art and science are joining hands, and again, they're working together toward a common objective. This is, of course, absolutely wrong. Science is a field that seeks to understand and simplify and predict behavior. It seeks to look radically in an empirical fashion to phenomena and seeks to understand them, whereas in the arts in general, what we seek to do is to interrupt that kind of interpretation. We seek ambiguity. We benefit from poetry. We like to slow down things. We like to ask questions that can never be answered. And so while these 2 fields are very different in their objectives, of course, they do share some methodology. They share curiosity, which is a theme I see in this festival. And they share also, just like a desire for a process, for the development of a language and a structure for things to be interpreted. Anyway, as you'll see in the presentations that I'll give you, there are some projects that are definitely nerdy. They start from the technologies itself that we've developed at the studio. Other times they come more from social or political or aesthetic, sort of desires or needs in the project. So I'll start with this project called Body Movies. It's a project that was inspired by this engraving by Samuel von Hoogstraten, where shadow plays were used to understand perspective. One of the things that I loved about it is the very large shadows are monstrous, whereas the little ones are angelic and pure. And there's this relationship of scale to monstrosity, which was very interesting. And the engraving was made in Rotterdam, in the city where we actually did the project. And it's basically a large shadow play. It's 12,000 square feet of interactive projections. We used 2 very powerful projectors to cast the image of people from Rotterdam onto the facade of the building, projecting them 60 foot high. And then we used 2 very powerful projectors on the floor, which would wash out the portrait. So if there was nobody walking past the bottom projectors, you wouldn't really see anything. You would just see like this bright light on the square. But then as soon as you would cross the path of the bottom projectors, your shadow would be projected 6 foot high all the way to 60 foot high, and a game of representation would ensue. So this is a project that, contrary to traditional Son et Lumière or fireworks displays or Olympic festival or something like this, it doesn't have a beginning or an end. It doesn't have like a pre-established narrative. It just invites people to self-represent. It invites people to take over the platform, to, in a way, personalize public space, take ownership of it, and then create these ad hoc narratives with their image. One of the beautiful things about working with shadows is that we all have a moderately sophisticated language of what can be done with a shadow. So every culture has a tradition of shadow theater or puppetry. We all play with shadows at night when we're kids. So contrary to most of the work in electronic media, including my own, this is a very intuitive interface. People would, rather quickly be able to start working on the project. Now, the system was completely out of my control. That's a thing that we come back over and over again, which is the idea that the artwork as a platform, nobody tells you what to do or not to do. And that creates for quite surprising effects. In terms of technology, there's a computer vision system. It's basically a surveillance camera that is observing the shadows. This is a very early version. It's much better now, much more ominous. And what we're looking for is for an overlap between the shadows and the portraits. And when an overlap happens, automatically we trigger a small feedback sound in public space, tick, just to let you know that you've just discovered that. But more importantly, once all of the portraits in a given scene are revealed, automatically the system blacks out. It cues a new image and then invites people to, sort of discover the new portraits. Because the piece is not so much about the portraits, but about becoming the portraits. So you see here, these three people just kind of collaborate. They see all of them, computer blacks out, brings out a new image, and then people reorganize in public space. So the kind of thing that ends up happening with these out-of-control systems, as I was saying, is this desire to self-represent. There is, the stuff that you're going to see a total of 5 minutes of this, but I have like 60 hours worth of what people did with this system. We had a man on a wheelchair project himself 60 foot high, crush everybody under his wheels, and derive a lot of pleasure from this. We had, break dancers, old ladies. We had all sorts of interesting content, and it would change depending on the day of the week, right? So weekends, there would be a lot of kids and families. Tuesdays was methadone night at the nearby church, so all the addicts would come and prance around. So it changed as time went by. Now the interface, the actual surveillance aspect of the project was projected in public space together with with descriptions in English and Dutch. But the truth is that most people didn't really care about, the nerdy part of it. They just wanted to get involved with each other through these shadows. And pretty much like in Van Hoogstraten, it ended up being quite monstrous. So she, for example, abused her boyfriend for 3 hours. And the truth is, many people did not really care about whether the portraits were being revealed or not, and that's fine. One of the uncomfortable things with this kind of project is they're very expensive to show because you're using basically the world's brightest projectors. And the sponsors kind of get concerned over content, but people will always deliver content if you let them. So I think she is just... So these platforms for participation allow people to take over their public space. One of the statements that I make in terms of ideas, since we're in IdeaFestival, is the notion that there is a crisis of representation in public space, right? Churchill once said, "We make buildings and buildings make us." But the contemporary situation suggests that that's not the case anymore. A new building in Louisville is going to be very similar to one in Mexico City or Singapore. And the reason is because these architects, developers, urban planners, they're not really, reflecting the citizens. It's more reflecting capital, right? Like, how can we most efficiently optimize the design to be able to build these, sort of offices or living quarters. And the solutions, of course, are similar in all of these cases. So we're looking at a massive homogenization of what the city looks like. As part of my job, I go around the world and different politicians say, oh, Raphael, we want to revitalize the city center. What can we do? And often when politicians mean by revitalizing the city center, they mean putting like 19th century lampposts, cobblestones, and Gap stores. And that's exactly the opposite of what must be done, because what I think art can do is create this intensely eccentric and useless and passionate moments of interruption of this homogeneity that we're seeing globally. So projects like this, all of a sudden you're walking down your street, you have been doing this for 20 years, and then all of a sudden you're sharing your space with other people. There's an American composer called Frederick Chevsky, who I admire very much, and he in the 60s was talking about coming together. Very simple concept, this idea that what we're doing here, we're not connecting through the internet, we're not sending each other messages or mail. We are face-to-face, we're sharing our space, our air, our hormones, and there's something very special about that. There's a communion. Not communion understood in a spiritual way, it can be understood that way, but not so much that. It's more like the acknowledgement of complicity, of people being together. And I think that that's what the arts brings to the table. It brings the capability to have experiences where people will engage with their city and each other in a different way. So that's body movies. I've done many, many shadow plays. This one was most recently done in Trafalgar Square in London. It's also a portraiture project. But in this one, what we did is we have over 1,000 video portraits taken in the cities where the project is shown. So in London, we work with Tate and Science Museum and other places to record volunteers. And then what happens is these people appear inside of your shadow. So as you're walking in the square, all of a sudden you find somebody who's kind of hanging out inside of your shadow. And when you're on top of him or her, he or she wakes up and establishes eye contact. For as long as you're on top of him or her, the portrait will remain engaged. It's kind of like oscillating and just checking you out. It's not really a loop. We call it scrubbing of the playhead. So we kind of go fast and slow, and we just sort of keep the eye contact going. And then the moment that you're not interested in the portrait anymore, you walk away. And as you walk away, the portrait goes back to sleep and disappears. So the idea of this relationship is in a way a two-way system. You're an observer, but you're also unobserved. So this kid walks away, this portrait disappears, this person is engaging with this portrait, she goes back to sleep and disappears and never appears in the same location. So in an area that is over 20,000 foot square, you have the presentation of all of these different portraits. Now, I did this project, well, I'll tell you first about the technology behind it. It uses the world's biggest, brightest projector. I was telling you about my insecurity, so it had to be the brightest. It's 110,000 ANSI lumens. And then robotic projectors, which would put the portraits anywhere inside of the square. But most crucially, we had a system that was a surveillance system that not only would detect where people were in the square, but it would also predict where you would be in the future, 3 seconds into the future. And we use that information to actually create the system. So here's the camera. On the bottom right, you see those 3 people are walking. The crosshairs show you where they're going to be, likely going to be in 3 seconds into the future. And then that information allows us to put portraits in their path. So, for example, this guy over here is walking. The computer sees that he's going to be around here, so chooses a projector that will put a portrait on his or her path. And the reason that's important is because we didn't want the portraits coming to you. We wanted you to encounter the portraits. It's kind of like a ghostly experience. So projects like this one is called Underscan, which was originally done in 2005, are technically quite complex, but the technology behind it to be able to rotate and undeform and scale the portrait so that automatically they'd be the right scale for your own shadow, that's all kind of behind the scenes, and it's part of the exciting part of this, but it's technologically quite complex to do. So this is the thousands of people that we had as volunteers. In this project, we explained to the volunteers what we were trying to do. We gave them complete freedom to self-represent, so they could do whatever they wanted to do. The only thing we asked them is, at one point, look straight at the camera. And that's the point that we trigger when your shadow is on top of the portrait. But because it's freedom to self-represent, and because it's England, I don't know if you've worked in England very much, but they're a wild bunch. They would some would take off their clothes, some would do sign language, some would do all sorts of stuff, and I like that. I like that I am no one to actually tell people what to do or not to do. They become, sort of the agents for their own image. This guy says, "You look because I'm not homeless." So, so while these projects may not have the sophistication of video masters like Bill Viola or Pipilotti Rist or Gary Hell, what they do have is this sense of content that's out of control, the sense of immediacy. Sometimes people would come and look for themselves in this square, and rarely would they find themselves, but I did see that once or twice, and it's straight out of David Lynch, because you would sort of just see yourself. It was very, very strange. So this is Underscan. In 2006, I was invited to transform this textile factory, the first automated textile factory in Mexico from the 19th century. And the project that we did became something that is now a little bit of a, I guess, signature project of mine. It's a project which uses light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs, to reflect the heartbeats of participants. So what it is basically a machine or a sensor not unlike what you might find at a gym, which measures your electrical activity of your heart and then translates it into light flashes in a light bulb. So the way it worked is this. At the very beginning of the project, I can't help myself, I go first. So that's my heartbeat. The computer records it and loops it and sends it to the very first light bulb in the entire room. All right, so there we go. Now here comes a second person, second participant, who holds onto the sensor, and notice when she does that, how not only the heart rate is different, but the attack on the tungsten filament is different. We're measuring systolic and diastolic activity, and we're actually trying to map that out onto the filament. So this is her heartbeat, and when she releases the sensor, her heartbeat goes to the first light bulb, and mine gets pushed down one position. So there we go. Now we have two people participating. Here comes my friend who drinks a lot of Red Bull. So this is what happens when you drink too much Red Bull. Boom, 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 boom. All right, so again, he pushes all the previous recordings down one position. And here comes a curator who thinks we're going to electrocute everybody. What happens inside the heart of a curator? You're about to find out. This is what it looks like to be a curator. And then once 100 people participate, the entire room gets populated by the vital signs of the past 100 participants. And as you walk into that room, you're surrounded by this heartbeats. And I wouldn't say it's pleasant, because it's kind of syncopating and arrhythmic and complex. But there is something very, sort of special about this biorhythms and being able to visualize them like this. A romantic story about this, the genesis of this project is my wife was pregnant with twins, and being a nerd, I asked the doctors to please bring 2 ultrasound machines so that we could hear the heartbeats of the boy and the girl at the same time in the womb. And we did that, and it was just fascinating because they were so different in rhythm that they created this kind of music together, and we wanted in a way to implement that in a large-scale artwork such as Paul's room. As Alice mentioned, I represented Mexico at the Venice Biennale. Apart from the work that you just saw, I showed another 4 works. This is one of them. It's called Wave Function, and it's basically a robotic array of chairs. And when you walk past it, there is a computerized surveillance system that detects your presence, and it generates waves of motion throughout the whole array. So it's literally fluid dynamics matched onto this motors on this Eames designed chairs with a Sarinen base. And as with some of my public artworks, what I'm seeking to do in this kind of projects is ask, questions about absence and presence, like who is the observer, who is the observed, who is the public, how can artworks such as this set of chairs actually behave in an anti-modular way, in an eccentric way. And when we opened this piece in Venice, my gallerist said, we should put some chain to protect them and whatever. It's like, of course not, let's let everybody just look at them and they'll never sit on them. But within 6 minutes, a big curator from the Guggenheim went and sat on one and broke them. And I told him, you break it, you buy it, but it didn't fly. And then the tracking system, the surveillance apparatus, is shown in a room next door. Pretentiously, I call that the Brechtian moment, the moment where we reveal the mechanisms of tracking, because we're aware that we're complicit with what we denounce. In other words, my artworks police people through very ominous surveillance systems to create this kind of experience. The next project I'll show you is perhaps the one that I'm most proud of. I'm not proud of it because of what I did, but because of the way that people participated. A little bit of context on this project. In 1968, the Mexican government massacred around 300 students, depends on who you ask, peaceful students who were protesting 10 days before the Olympics were to arrive in the city. The soldiers massacred, and then that very night, all the blood was cleaned from the Tlatelolco Square, which is where this happened, and then the media was silenced and no one talked about it for about 30 years. And then that site now is part of the UNAM University. It's a very big, independent, autonomous university. And they commissioned me to do a memorial for the 40th anniversary of this project. And most of the artists that I'm interested in, people like Krzysztof Wodishko or Johann Gertz or Rachel Whiteread, make their best projects with very dark, ominous memories, such as this one. So for the project, what I did is I created this installation right on the square where the massacre took place. And let me just show you a little bit of the video for that. So let me just fast forward. So for voz alta, which means loud voice, a megaphone was placed on the massacre and it converted your voice to light.
La represión que vivimos en este momento, los mártires, todas aquellas personas que lucharon, que vieron por el futuro, pues muchas veces los dejamos en el olvido o solo recordamos la típica frase, el 2 de octubre no se olvida, mas no estamos enterados de los hechos o la trascendencia que tuvo. Entonces es un llamado de exhortación.
So as she spoke, her voice would become light with this very, very bright searchlight. The searchlight would then go and hit the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it would be beamed to the rest of the city. The voices were completely uncensored and unmoderated. So what we ended up seeing was very, very touching, sort of stories from people. Like, for instance, this is a survivor of the massacre. We had a man saying, my name's so-and-so, and I'm here to say that I'm the son of one of the soldiers who committed the massacre, and I'm a new generation. I've lived with this guilt all my life, and we're all like really electric. Another fellow said, my name's so-and-so, and I'm a fireman, and I'm here to denounce that routinely the Mexican government asks us to put coloring dye in our water tanks, so when we spray protesters, they're easily identified. And I became a fireman because I want to protect people, not be part of the apparatus of oppression. I mean, it was just like nonstop, really touching content. And this is one of the really fascinating things about this kind of media art, about this interactive art, is that the idea, the democratic potential, let's call it, for an artwork that is out of control, is key to be able to bring out and to exorcise certain, sort of social hang-ups and memories and traumas that we have. Mexican people, even though the situation has changed radically, they're still silenced. We still are not heard. And what I wanted to do with this project is not just to talk about the silencing of those students in '68, but also what was happening now, right? So a lot of people were on the megaphone just talking about the more recent massacres, like the massacre of Acteal, or about the fact that the media are still, very much controlling the information that goes out. So the interesting thing about this project is once, as I was saying, once it hits the foreign affairs, it would go into the city. And if you were on your car driving, or you looked out the window of your office or your home and you would see these lights flashing, you could actually tune into 96.1 FM live and listen to what the lights were saying, unmoderated and uncensored. And this was really important. Your voice became light, but it also became FM waves. And FM radio was critical to sort of complete that cycle of communication. So as you listen to it, you would understand what was going on in Tlatelolco.
Perpetrada en Tlatelolco, octubre 2, 1968, y los culpables no han sido castigados. Todo el sistema judicial mexicano es visto por la ciudadanía, según todas las encuestas, como algo ajeno y contrario a ella. Ahí están las matanzas del 10 de junio de 1971.
So this was a radio program, right? So if nobody would take the microphone and speak, there would be nothing in 96.1 FM. So what we did is we started mixing memories from the past, from survivors of the massacre, from poets and intellectuals back from their memories of '68. And in this way, we, instead of just sort of highlighting this massacre as something that is stored, we would mix the archival material with the living situation and the expressions of today. And in that way, sort of activated the site. At least I'd like to think that. Now, of course, we didn't just get memorial speeches and so on. We also got marriage proposals and rappers and poets and all sorts of shout-outs. And that's also part of the beauty of these kinds of projects, is that the content is quite diverse. All right, so something a little bit more uplifting. This is a project here in the States, in Santa Monica. It's a project done for one of these festivals, kind of like Nuit Blanche. It just takes place over one night. It's called Glow. And what we did is, what you see there are two sandboxes, which are elevated on risers. And these two sandboxes are 40 meters away, so whatever that is in feet. And there's very powerful projectors. When you stick your hands into the little sandboxes, your hands get picked up by the cameras and get projected onto the beach. And so all of a sudden you're huge to them. But at the same time as they see you, there's a surveillance system tracking the people on the beach. And you see those little black dots on the sandbox? That's the people on the beach. So you see them and they see you. And you share three scales, right? Because the sandboxes are immediately beside the actual beach area. So people would sort of take turns to take over the platform. And sometimes you'd be like huge, and sometimes you'd be the small person. The technology used in this project is actually this hardcore tracking systems using infrared surveillance, similar to the ones that you might have at the border to track for Mexicans, or at your shopping mall to track teenagers. And so we take this kind of predatorial technologies, which are supposed to keep us safe, and we propose something that we believe does make you safer, which is to create connectivity in space, to create complicity, to create relationships. So how do you take those very dark technologies and of suspicion and create instead environments where your little doggy and his boots can be showcased. So in this project, similar to, say, the shadow place, if there's nobody doing anything in the sandboxes or participating, there's nothing to see. It's just something that develops over time. So let's just see. This guy likes to burn people, so this guy just walks around. Here's Coca-Cola guy. So you get the picture. So there's hours and hours of this material. So that's Sandbox. I'm also doing sort of smaller works. Some of them are at the 21C here in Louisville. These are installations that, again, are about absence and presence, but at a scale that is more modest. This piece is called Please Empty Your Pockets, and it's basically a scanner not unlike what you might find at an airport. You put your stuff into the conveyor belt, it goes through a scanner, and then when it comes out on the other side, it leaves an image of itself. And then that image is surrounded by previous images of other stuff that people have put into the conveyor belt. So the content of the project itself is the crowdsourced, sort of input that people have put into it. We did this project first in Manchester for about 6 months, and you would not believe what British people carry in their pockets. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you. But the fun part of this project, again, is that as time passes, the memory grows, and oftentimes, like for instance, in England, a lot of people had switchblades, like knives. I don't know why. Somebody might have put one there, and then everybody says, "Oh yeah, well I got mine," and everybody's like putting down there. So it became a very knife-oriented installation. But depending on where you show it, that might change. So that's Please Empty Your Pockets. Similar, I've done a lot of work with Pulse. So you've seen the Pulse room, which is the one where your heartbeat is in incandescent lights. This one's similar, except it's a project where we measure your heartbeat and we photograph with a microscope, we photograph your fingerprints. So you stick your finger into this device. I love telling the public to do that. Please put your finger into this orifice. So they put it in, and you see a little electrocardiogram. It starts measuring the difference of opacity of your finger. It gives you your heart rate. And then it records your fingerprint, and it adds it to a database of over 10,000 previous fingerprints that have been tried in the installation itself. So it's a spiral, it's a Fibonacci spiral, so it gets smaller and smaller until the size of the fingerprints themselves is life-sized. I, like everybody else, like things that crash. So here is a project which is made out of measuring tapes or tape measures. Now these tape measures have a sensor that detect where you are, and they automatically jet out and project onto vertically. The tapes don't measure distance, they measure time. So as you stand, this fellow's walking through and he's making them go up, but as you stand, if you stay for a while in front of one of these, it'll come to a moment where it gets metastable and then it'll crash. And universally, it's a very satisfying moment. And not just for kids. So I'm sure you've tried this at home. Here it goes. Oh, please, please. And then it crashes. And then the project is just a bunch of crashing over and over. Once the tapes crash, they recoil back automatically, and it all starts over again. We're tracking with the Kinect, which is like a $200 game controller, which is infinitely superior to what we've been working on, our own proprietary 20-year tracking system. I hate Microsoft so much. But now we use it because we think, okay, well, this is better, so we'll just use theirs. And then the system, what it does is it becomes a game, if you will, of people just making the whole system crash. And it's a measurement, right? So I was saying that the tape measures keep track of how long you were in front of them. What the system does is every hour, it prints out how much time was wasted by the sum of all visitors. So it's just a simple little recorder of time. All right, I think I have a couple more projects to show. I went back to being insecure, so we built the world's largest aerostat, circular spherical aerostat. It's a 15-meter diameter balloon filled with helium, and it floats over Federation Square in Melbourne, Australia, and then we're using 5 very bright projectors around it to project graphical representations of the activity of the surface of the sun. So these are not videos, they're actual equations, things like Perlin noise, reaction diffusion, Navier-Stokes, fractal flames, which are simulating how the turbulence of the sun actually takes place. And the system also has NASA imagery. It sort of sits there at night, providing for a weird kind of sun at night. It does not heat, unfortunately, it's a fraud. But the system itself is about visualization of scale, because this balloon is precisely 100 million times smaller than the real thing. And so we like this idea of being able to materialize in public space what this, incredible stellar phenomena are like. We're about to do this project again in England later on this year. And because it's not a video, we can actually interact with it. So if you have like an iPhone or a tablet or whatever, you can actually choose from different seasons. The sun has 11 years of seasons. You can caress the surface, what I'm doing there, touching you see that little dot seeding the equations. That's actually me making the sun more turbulent. And you can, sort of change different parameters of the sun, almost as if it were a remote control. There's sound in the piece too, so there's, let's see if we can hear it. There's like a parametric sound, so the sound itself is also generated by the seasons and is not a pre-recording. Now, projecting onto a balloon, looks easy, and people say, oh yeah, well, he just, projected this onto a balloon. But it's actually technologically quite hard because, as you may know, balloons bob and sway, and our tracking system actually tracked where the balloon was in 3 dimensions and compensated for the movement of the graphics. So from your perspective, when you go see it, you go, oh yeah, it works and whatever, but to actually match it is not, it's hard, basically. All right, 2 more projects, small ones. This one is a little shadow object, and what it is a little branch that we found in the park, and we scan the branch in 3D, and then we use a thing called an L system, which is an equation that allows for the entire tree from where the branch came to be projected in 3D. So the shadow of the branch is the entire tree. And what you're seeing here is the, sort of small hotel edition, wink. We also have a huge version where the tree is actually 12 meters wide, so there's actually 1-to-1 scale. The branch remains tiny, and you get that kind of thing. And the shape of the branch is this bifurcated, sort of Y shape, which is, I don't know if in English you have that, but it's for looking for water. It's like an amulet, but it's also a slingshot, right? So it has many, many different sort of interpretations. So this is bifurcation. And finally, a project called Last Breath. For the Havana Biennial last year, we had the privilege of meeting this woman, Omara Portuondo, who is, she's a singer, the singer of Buena Vista Social Club. She's 85-year-old, she's awesome. And what we asked her, she's the voice of Cuba, we asked her to blow onto this brown paper bag, right? To breathe into it. And then we closed that bag, we took it back to the exhibition space, and we hooked it up to a device which actually takes her breath and makes the bag breathe 10,000 times a day, which is the normal respiratory frequency for an adult at rest. So this machine of bellows and motors just keeps track of how many times it's been breathing. And the idea with this project is you can see sort of the interior of the piece. The idea is to sort of mimic that respiration. So the piece size, it goes 158 times a day, goes like that. And the idea is that when Omara Portuondo dies, her breath will stay circulating in the device. And so this particular copy of the work is going to end up in the National Museum of Music in Cuba, where people will be able to go and visit the last breath of Omara Portuondo. So a funny story with this is another copy of this work was recently acquired by the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. And they asked me, okay, this is a biometric portrait, right? We're portraying somebody and we're trying to do something impossible, which is capture this ephemeral presence, which is our breath or our sigh. And they asked, well, who do you suggest that we portray here? And I said, well, being Montreal, the right person to portray is Leonard Cohen, the poet and singer. And they said, okay, fine. So then they acquired the work. And but then they asked me, if I would consider putting Celine Dion inside. I said, no, I'm not Celine Dion. Not Celine Dion. And the way I did it is I said, listen, this is a project for people over 80. This is a memorial. I think she's going to be insulted if we ask her to keep her breath. And there's like, oh, no, we don't want to insult Celine. So Leonard Cohen is back in. And yeah, this is sort of a simple, impossible project just to remind us of this memento mori, that we're all in this together. We're all just going to go away, that there's this fleeting existence that in this case cannot be recorded or captured, but we can still try. So that's my presentation, and I think we have some time for questions. Thank you.
Little time for questions, and I think there are microphones in the aisles.
Raphael, thanks for a great presentation. Could you talk about your collaboration with architects that you might, on those early pieces of the squares with the shadows?
Sure.
And also the maintenance commitment when somebody installs something like that?
So in my team in Montreal is 10 people. So we are, some of them, there's 2 architects, there's 2 mechanical engineers, 2 are electrical engineers, and the others are artists. And we work very closely in all the projects. There is no hierarchy in the system. Our model for collaboration is based on the performing arts. So there's not like say a democratic collaboration, but there's a structure. There's a director, which is in this case is me, but then there's a composer and a writer and an actor, or whoever is there will always be credited. If you go to my website and you look at any project, everybody who was involved, it's credited there. I like performing arts as a model for how to actually understand responsibilities. And I did try to work in a collective, but that works only for the people in the collective. It's a mess for the public. The public needs biases and idiosyncrasies and nightmares and passions. Apart from these 10 collaborators in my studio, we then have other relationships. So for example, we've worked a lot with architects. We still do. And often it really depends. Like our first collaboration with an architect was Arata Isozaki in Japan in 2003. And his contribution was, he said, you can do anything you want, just don't touch my building. So I was like, okay, that's a new way to collaborate. But other architects are much more dialogic, and it's fun to work with them. And then in terms of maintenance, the projects vary widely. So a lot of the very large-scale public installations are ephemeral. They're there for 3 weeks. They're on every night between 6 p.m. and midnight or something like that, and then they go away. And that's why also the theatrical metaphor works, because you come in, you activate a space, and then it goes away. Something like the shadow play would never work as something that's permanent, because you really want it to be a surprise, something that takes place, and then it goes from city to city. But I do have some public, interactive, permanent pieces, and maintenance is a big concern for all of us. I think not enough attention is being paid by my colleagues and by myself on the subject of conservation and maintenance of these projects. But fortunately, there's a lot of really good models. For instance, there's the beautiful model of the public fountain. Universally, whenever I talk to a politician, usually it's a politician, about my work, and I refer to it as a public fountain, it liberates all of this stress, because for magical historical reasons, people understand that a fountain is an initial investment, followed by you have to clean the valves, change the light bulbs, put some chlorine, and have somebody take care of it. And because it's an icon of abundance, and it's a landmark, and we all sort of think of a fountain as a place to get together, you don't need to justify it. So the trick that I have in terms of maintenance and explaining from the beginning to the collector or the stakeholder what's involved is to speak about fountains.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, this is a little bit low. Hi. Art is so much about communication, and you seem to be very comfortable in the role of kind of a ground layer for stories. So how has your work over the years changed how you understand other stories and how you tell your own stories?
Thanks for that. Sorry to be a jerk. I don't know if that's a bad word, jerk? Yeah. I can say that, right? Yes, okay. But I completely disagree, I'm sorry. Art has nothing to do with communication. Communication is this corporate thing where, you can actually, sort of tax our time together talking to each other, right? Communication is about the efficient transmission of information from one side to the other. Art is not about that efficiency. It's not about that optimization. Art is much more about communion, about this moment of sharing. It's inexplicable. It cannot be quantified. The telecom cannot charge us for this moment of complicity, right? And so I always kind of, become militant against this idea of communication, because I find it utilitarian. It's as if art had a use. No, Auden poet said that art is useless, but it's not worthless. And I like that kind of idea that what we're here to do is to confuse people. We're actually here to slow down communication, to do interceptions. Think of poem. A poem can be read very differently by you or by me. It's not about communication. I mean, if the fellow really wanted to communicate, he or she would write more clearly. But they don't. They specifically make us confused, because that is the joy. The joy of reading is the enjoyment that we get out of it. So I know what you're saying, though. There are stories behind all of this. But the stories that I am here to tell are not, they're equally important as the stories that the public tells itself. So that's what I don't want to do. I don't want to impose a story on anybody. I want to create a platform that then tells stories to me, that is surprising in a way. Thank you.
Okay, over here.
Hi, you mentioned certain politicians asking you for memorials and revitalization of public spaces.
Yeah.
And you do use a lot of public spaces for the works you showed us. How do your works affect the public spaces after they're gone?
Well, I mean, the hope is that the absence of the work is actually something that has changed the work. It's almost a homeopathic thing. There's a beautiful work by Johann Goetz, is the Memorial for the Holocaust in Hamburg. And what he did is he put this enormous, phallic monolith, black monolith, in the middle of Hamburg, and then let people sort of scratch it and graffiti and whatever. And over time, this monolith was descending into the ground. And if you go today to Hamburg to see this monument to the Holocaust, I mean, how do you represent something such as a Holocaust? All you see is a little plaque, and you can step on top of this buried monolith. So the disappearance of the artwork in this case is actually the effective way to actually remember and feel a relationship to these events. So I believe that absence and presence are not mutually exclusive. They coexist. And sometimes the absence of the shadows might make you think about the living space in a very, very different way. Also, I have a statement about, there's a guy called Mikhail Bakhtin who talks about the carnivalesque. So this idea that all of a sudden these artworks come and go, and the fact that they're ephemeral is what makes them interesting, because people interrupt their normal programming, they put on the mask, and they play. And that's the energy that we're looking for public space in general.
Go ahead. If you're a student, will you say where you're at school when you ask your question?
Hi, I go to DuPont Manual High School, and I was wondering, like, what is your art process when you're first commissioned? What is the first thing you do?
It depends. So we divide 50-50. 50% of the time we're parasites. So we are invited to, okay, so we've got this public space. We want to have more pedestrians in the area. We want to take over public space with activities other than shopping. That's awesome. We want you to do a project. And then I look at the stakeholders, at the history of the site, the budget, and then I come up with a project for that space. So that's a parasitic way. And the other way, the other 50%, is more bottom-up. So we start playing around with materials or with techniques or strategies or concepts, and then we build a project for which we have no objective or no deadline or no venue. And then once it's ready in the studio, we tour it. Those are two very, very different models of development. And I recommend that artists do both, because it just gives you more freedom to be able to create.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I go to Manual as well. I was wondering if you ever use any eco-friendly materials in your artwork?
Yeah, I do. So some of the projects that I do are intensely, I did a project for the Vancouver Olympics, which used 250,000 watts of power. And the CBC, the national broadcaster in Canada, called it Environmental September 11th. And so I just like, okay, that's interesting that you say that, because 250,000 watts of power, yes, it's a lot, but it's also a tenth what a typical hockey game uses. And then they're all like, oh shit, like, don't touch our hockey, It's like, no, because it's very important to give people the elements to be able to compare. Now, I'm a dad of 3 kids, and of course I care about the environment. And so in projects such as Victorial Elevation, the Vancouver project, yes, we use that power, but we try and use biodiesel, for instance. So we try and use renewable resources. We pay for zero carbon footprint. So we're using 250,000 watts of power, which, with a couple $1,000s, you can actually pay for reforestation, which will let you sleep a little bit more at night. And more importantly, the light pollution and sort of energy that you're using is for a very, very specific amount of time, and then it goes away. Having said all of this justifications, I do have projects, for example, that are fountains. I'm doing a lot of work with fountains, for example. And one of the #1 priorities in my fountain works is that when there's no people, the fountain should shut off. That's how it should be. And then be very sort of economical in considering the usage of any elements that might damage the environment. So.
Okay, one more quick question.
I'm Jay Foster from Fern Creek, and I really like all your work and everything that you do. But a few questions I had was, what really inspired you to start making all these projects, and why spend so much time and money just for the entertainment of human beings? Because, like, in my vision, I see it as, like, we're all just creatures that you want to just see them interact with your works. And I would personally, if I lived in Mexico or if you made those projects, I would spend hours on that. But like,
would or wouldn't? Did you say you would or you wouldn't?
I would.
You would.
But,
okay.
But like, why would you like devote so much of your energy and everything into your work?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, because ultimately that's a question we all must ask ourselves. Like, what is our own complicity with the situation that we're living in? I mean, I'm, like everybody else, concerned about the state of affairs. I come from a country that has very intense economic violence. I come from a country that has very intense racial divisions. And by the way, so do you. So you and I both share a deep urgency to change things. And there's some people who are really good at changing them at a level of policy. They've got the passion and the patience to deal with it that way. Kudos to them. I believe that art you know, maybe a vehicle for transformation. Call me a utopian or an idealist, but I do believe that developing tracking systems for something other than target acquisition or the recognition of an ethnic origin is just not the right approach to create a safer society. Our politicians believe, and this is really sad, you guys, we gotta work on this, is after Patriot Act and Homeland Security, that the solution to safety in the United States is to put more cameras and facial recognition and, you know, all of this kind of things. The solution is not more cameras. The solution is more projectors. What we need is not cameras that will assume suspicion and compare you to a database of suspicious individuals. What we need is more experiences that will connect us to each other to create cohesive communities. The technology is not a solution. The solution is translation, exchange, cultural things. That's where society and civility begins and ends. You know, just to end, Churchill said, this is a very famous quote, let's see if I remember it properly. He said, they were asked during the Second World War, they asked Churchill, well, you know, we should shut down the funding for the arts, you know, and this says, well, then why are we fighting this war? You know, like, that's why we're fighting, because we want to preserve the arts. This is who we are as a people. So I think that that's kind of where I'd like to see myself pretentiously.
Thank you so much.